My dad told me I'd never amount to anything 15 years later. I was his landlord and he didn't even know it. The first time my father signed his name on a lease in my building, he did it with the same irritated confidence he used whenever he assumed the world was slightly beneath him. He didn't look up when he signed. He didn't ask who owned the place. He didn't notice the name printed at the top of the management packet. And he definitely didn't expect that the woman standing behind the frosted office glass, holding a file with his application clipped neatly inside, was the daughter he had once told would never amount to anything. He only looked up when the leasing agent said, "Miss Vale will go over the final terms with you." Val, my last name. The one he had not heard spoken aloud in 15 years, unless it was followed by disappointment. Irritation. Or silence. When he turned and saw me standing there, I watched something ancient and ugly pass through his face. Not guilt first, recognition first. Guilt came a second later, then disbelief. Then the reflex I knew best of all, contempt. Not full contempt. Not enough to survive what he was seeing, but enough to show me that even now, even after all the years, some part of him still believed he should never have to live inside the consequences of his own judgment. He blinked once, looked from me to the office door, then back to the paperwork in his hand, for one absurd second. I thought he might try to pretend it wasn't me, that he would call me by the wrong name, that he would act as if I merely resembled someone he used to know, that he would insist on confusion, because confusion is easier for men like him than accountability. Instead, he said, very quietly, "Naomi, I had imagined that moment 100 different ways. Anger, triumph, some perfect line sharpened over years, a speech so clean and devastating it would split the room in half. But real life is strange. When the moment finally came, what I felt first was not revenge. It was distance. The kind that only comes after surviving someone long enough that they can no longer reach the center of you. Yes, I said, it's my building. He stared at me, then at the lease packet, then at the logo on the wall behind the reception desk, then back at me again. He said, "That's not funny." I almost smiled, not because I was enjoying it, because it was such a pure Daniel Mercer response. Not confusion, not wonder, not remorse, authority. He had always preferred reality to become a misunderstanding if it preserved his rank. "I'm not joking," I said. The leasing agent, Marissa, looked from him to me, understood instantly that she had just stepped into the center of something far older than a rental agreement, and said, "I'm going to give you all a minute." Then she left the room and shut the door behind her. My mother was sitting beside him in a pale blue cardigan with both hands wrapped around her purse. She looked older than the last time I had seen her. Smaller too. Not physically. In the way women look smaller after enough years spent apologizing for a man's gravity. She whispered my name once, just once, like she wasn't sure she still had the right. I didn't answer her. My father stood slowly. "You own this place?" he asked. "This property is part of my portfolio." I said, "I own it." He looked at the paperwork again. The ownership disclosure, the company name, the line where my name appeared in black print, so ordinary it almost seemed rude. Naomi Vale Properties. Mine. All those years. He had acted like I was a temporary mistake in his house. Now his housing security was sitting under my signature. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to take you back to where this story actually started. Because this story did not begin in that leasing office. It began 15 years earlier. In a dining room where my father decided that my ambition counted for less than my brother's excuses. If this story resonates with you, like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want the whole thing. These stories are for people who understand that the loudest betrayal is not always the one that happens in public. Sometimes it is the one repeated quietly at home until you start mistaking contempt for truth. I grew up in a narrow 2-story house in Dayton, Ohio, with peeling white trim, a porch that leaned slightly to the left, and floorboards that announced every bad mood before a door even opened. My father, Daniel Mercer, believed in order. That was his word for it, order. What he actually meant was obedience. Predictability. A home where everyone adjusted themselves around his moods quickly enough that he could call it respect. He sold industrial supplies to manufacturing companies across the state. He wore polos tucked too tightly into his jeans on weekends and acted like every meal at our table was a board meeting no one else had prepared for correctly. He liked receipts. He liked spreadsheets. He liked labels facing forward in the pantry. He liked people most when they made themselves useful, and least when they required emotional labor he had not volunteered to perform. My mother, Karen, had once been softer. That's how my aunt described her when I was little. Softer. Before life narrowed her. Before fear became her default posture. Before she learned that peace in our house usually meant agreement with whichever version of reality my father wanted most that day. Then there was my younger brother, Evan. If I was the child expected to understand everything without being told, Evan was the child expected to be forgiven for everything before he had even done it. He was funny in the way boys are allowed to be funny when adults decide charm counts as character. He forgot homework, lost jackets, brought home mediocre grades attached to explanations so polished they almost sounded impressive. He could make irresponsibility look like personality. My father called him spirited. When I asked too many questions, I was called difficult. That was the pattern of our house. Evan made mistakes. I absorbed consequences. Evan got room. I got responsibility. Evan was allowed to become. I was expected to prove. And because I was the older one, and the quieter one, and the girl, everyone acted as if this arrangement had not been invented by the family, but discovered in nature. I learned early that love in our house was not evenly distributed. It was assigned, not with cruelty so obvious that outsiders would notice. That would have been easier. It was done in teaspoons, in who got interrupted, in who got remembered, in whose sadness was treated as a problem to solve, and whose was treated as a mood to outgrow, in who was allowed to fail with dignity, and who was expected to succeed without ever looking needy. When I was 11, I won a district essay contest and got invited to read downtown at a student showcase. My father forgot. Not dramatically. He just remembered too late. He drove in halfway through, stood in the back with his arms folded, and afterward said, "You should have spoken louder." People don't reward hesitation. When Evan struck out at Little League a month later and cried in the parking lot, my father bought him ice cream and spent 20 minutes explaining that real winners learn from setbacks. I remember that because I had not cried when I read in front of strangers. And I had not gotten ice cream either. At 12, I started babysitting. At 13, I cleaned houses on Saturdays with Mrs. Crater, Weaver from 2 streets over. At 14, I got my first real paycheck from a grocery store bagging groceries after school and on weekends. I liked work, not because I was virtuous, because work was measurable. You did it. You got paid. No guessing. No pleasing. No waiting for someone else's mood to decide if your effort counted. By 15, I was the one my father called into the garage when he needed inventory logged or folders labeled or old tax boxes sorted. He used to say, "At least one of my kids knows how the world works." It sounded like praise. It wasn't. It meant he trusted me to carry weight, not to receive care. That's an important difference. Children know it before adults admit it. When a parent consistently turns to you for labor instead of tenderness, you start understanding usefulness as the price of staying. I was good in school. Not valedictorian, not some prodigy, but good. Steady. Scholarship good. Teacher recommendation good. The kind of good that comes less from brilliance than from fear of losing control. By senior year, I had a plan. Community college for 2 years while working. Then transfer to finish a degree in accounting or business. Nothing glamorous. Something useful. Something portable. Something that could become a ladder if I climbed carefully enough. I got accepted to Sinclair with a small merit scholarship and more determination than optimism. I was 18. I had a used Honda with a cracked side mirror. I worked 25 hours a week at the grocery store, and I thought if I kept my head down long enough, I could build a future quietly enough that my family would not need to believe in it for it to become real. That was my first mistake, believing I merely needed to outwork contempt. The spring after I turned 19, Evan dropped out of his second semester at a private college my parents absolutely should not have been paying for. That happened on a Thursday. By Saturday, the whole house had reorganized itself around his disappointment. My father kept saying the program had not been right for him. My mother said maybe the environment had been too rigid. Evan said he was figuring things out. Everyone nodded as if figuring things out were a financial plan and not a luxury purchased on someone else's anxiety. By then, I had already finished a full day of work, studied for 2 exams, and filled out transfer planning documents for the next year. At dinner that Sunday, my father asked me what classes I was taking in the fall. I told him, intermediate accounting, business law, managerial finance, a writing elective because it fit the schedule. He stared at me for a second and said, "You really think any of that is going to turn into something?" The room went still in the way. Rooms go still when everyone knows something has shifted, but nobody wants to be the first to admit it. I thought maybe he was joking. Not because he was kind, because even he could not be this careless out loud. I said, "Yes." He gave a short laugh. Dismissive. Not amused. "Naomi," he said, "you're working checkout at a grocery store and taking classes at a community college. You're not building an empire. You're stalling." My mother looked down at her plate. Evan chewed slowly and kept his eyes on his food. I said, "I'm paying for school myself." My father leaned back in his chair. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "You think doing everything the hard way makes it noble? It doesn't. It just makes it small." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was the cruelest thing he ever said, because it was the first time he stripped away the pretense and said the real thing, small, to him. That was my crime, not failure. Smallness, building carefully where he preferred spectacle, choosing consistency where he preferred charisma, refusing collapse where he would have found me easier to manage. I said, "I'm doing what I can afford." He put his fork down. "That's the problem," he said. "You don't know when to stop pretending you have a plan." My mother whispered. "Dan," he ignored her, "your brother had real opportunities." He said, You're clinging to scraps and calling it ambition." I still remember the sound of the refrigerator humming behind me. The smell of roast chicken and pepper and dish soap, the exact circle of light over the table. Those details stay with you when humiliation becomes structural. I said, "I'm not asking you for anything." He looked at me then. The way men look at women, they have raised to be useful when those women become inconveniently clear. "You are never going to amount to anything." "Naomi." Evan stopped chewing. My mother closed her eyes. No one corrected him. That matters. I want to say that clearly. No one corrected him. There are wounds people cause with words. Then there are wounds people allow by saying nothing after. I got up from the table, not because I was brave, because I was going to cry, and I knew better than to do it where he could see. He said, "Don't walk away while I'm talking to you." I turned back. That part was instinct. Years of conditioning. The body still asking permission from the thing that harms it. Then he said, "Maybe when the world hits you hard enough, you'll finally understand who was trying to tell you the truth." That night I packed a duffel bag, not a full suitcase. A duffelbag. That detail matters, because I did not think I was leaving for good. I thought I was creating distance. A night or two with my friend Lena. Maybe a week. Long enough for him to cool off. Long enough for everyone to pretend it had not been as bad as it was. When I came downstairs with the bag, My father was in the living room watching the news. He looked at the duffel, then at me. "Where do you think you're going?" I said. "Out." He looked back at the television and said, "If you walk out that door, I don't come back, expecting to be supported." That's another kind of sentence parents say when they want deniability later. It gives them room to say it was your decision. I should have stayed quiet. I know that now. But there are moments when humiliation has already reached the bone and silence no longer protects anything. So I said, "Supported by what?" He muted the television. That got his full attention. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I already buy my own gas." I said, "I already pay for my books. I already work. I already stay out of your way. So what exactly would I be losing?" The room changed temperature. My mother said my name once. Just once. Softly. As if saying it fulfilled some minimum obligation, my father stood up. What happened next has lived in my body ever since. He walked past me, opened the front hall closet, pulled down a black trash bag from the shelf, came back, walked upstairs, then returned, carrying armfuls of clothes from my room. He shoved them into the bag in front of me. Jeans, a hoodie, a sweater, socks, my winter coat tangled halfway out of the opening, a pair of running shoes I had bought used from a clearance rack, 2 t-shirts I slept in, the cardigan my grandmother had given me before she died. Then he dropped the bag beside the duffel and said, "There, now you're ready." My mother gasped like she had not realized he meant to make it literal. Evan stood in the doorway, pale and useless, and I stood there staring at a trash bag full of my own clothes, understanding with a level of clarity that almost felt holy, that my father would rather humiliate me than be contradicted in his own house. I picked up the duffel. Then, the trash bag. No one stopped me. Not my mother. Not my brother. Not the man who had just told me the truth as he understood it. I walked out. Lena let me sleep on her couch for 3 nights. Then 5. Then 10. Her apartment smelled like vanilla candles, microwave popcorn, vet towels, and the sweet burnt dust scent that came from old baseboard heat. She kept saying I could stay as long as I needed. But we both knew she was one missed paycheck away from disaster herself. I worked extra shifts, dropped 1 class, kept the others, pretended I was more in control than I was because losing dignity and losing housing at the same time felt too dangerous. Then Mrs. Weaver heard what happened. Mrs. Weaver was in her late 50s then. Divorced. Practical. Ran a small bookkeeping service from a converted den and knew every landlord. Handyman. Tax preparer. And property manager in 3 zip codes. She was the kind of woman who could tell you 3 things at once while balancing a checkbook and stirring soup without spilling either. She looked at me across her kitchen table and said, "You can sleep in my spare room if you're willing to help me on Saturdays and not act like I'm doing charity." I nearly cried. Instead, I said, "I can do more than Saturdays." She said, "Good. I need someone who can alphabetize, not someone who collapses." That was how she loved. No softness at the surface. Just room. Her spare room was tiny. 1 bed, 1 dresser with a loose handle, a lamp that buzzed if you touched the cord wrong. To me, it felt like safety with curtains. The next 2 years were the hardest and cleanest of my life. I worked, studied, saved, cleaned houses, did data entry for Mrs. Weaver, learned QuickBooks, learned tenant ledgers, learned rent rolls, learned maintenance reserve math, learned why landlords made money on paper and lost it in plumbing, learned vacancy rates, escrow accounts, insurance headaches, property taxes, late fee rules, refinance timing, contractor lies, and why old buildings only love people who respect their hidden problems. While most people my age were learning which bars were fun on Friday, I was learning how depreciation schedules worked and why a duplex with bad wiring could erase a year of profit. I didn't know it then. But I was learning the language of the life that would one day save me. There were nights I came home so tired. I fell asleep in my jeans on top of the blanket, with a finance textbook open beside me. There were mornings I woke at 5 because the only quiet study time I had was before work. There were weeks where every dollar had a destination before it reached my hand. I did not feel inspiring. That's important. People always retrofit discipline into something beautiful once it succeeds, while you're inside it. Discipline mostly feels repetitive, unglamorous, lonely, sometimes humiliating. It feels like saying no to a coffee because the gas tank matters more. It feels like sewing a loose hem instead of replacing the pants. It feels like pretending you're not embarrassed when classmates talk about spring break and you talk about picking up a Sunday shift. I kept going, not because I believed success would prove anything to my father. At first, I just wanted not to need him. That was the dream. Not revenge. Not admiration. Not poetic justice. Not needing him. When I was 21, I transferred and finished my bachelor's degree in accounting while continuing to work. No glamorous montage. No fairy godmother. Just years. Years of saying no. Years of leftovers. Years of spreadsheets. Years of driving a car with no air conditioning in July. Years of pretending not to notice when my father's silence hardened into complete erasure. He never called. That deserves its own line. He never called. Not after he threw me out. Not on my birthday. Not after I graduated. Not when I changed apartments. Not when I passed the first section of the CPA exam. Not when I failed one section and had to retake it. Not when I got hired into my first office job. Not even when my mother secretly mailed me a $50 grocery card one Christmas with no note inside. That was the only thing she ever sent. And even then, she mailed it through a neighbor's return address. Sometimes people think abandonment needs to be active to count. It doesn't. Inactivity can become architecture if you sustain it long enough. At 24, I got my first full-time position with a regional property management company in Columbus. Not glamorous, but stable. I handled owner reports, budgeting, et vendeur réconciliation, occupancy analysis. I sat in meetings with men who talked over me until they realized I knew their numbers better than they did. I stayed late, listened more than I spoke, learned who cut corners and who built properly, learned which owners were rich and foolish, and which were merely disciplined enough to look boring. Boring is underrated. I learned that too. At 26, I started consulting independently on smaller portfolios. At 27, I had enough side income to move into a one-bedroom apartment that did not smell like someone else's dinner and old carpet cleaner. At 28, I partnered with Mrs. Bay and Bax, Weaver's nephew, Yule. On my first duplex purchase, Joel handled construction. I handled the books and operations. We bought ugly. We renovated carefully. We rented responsibly. We sold one. Refinanced another. Bought two more. There is a version of success people can see from the outside. And then there is the kind built in ledgers. Patience. And doing 1,000 boring things correctly. Mine was the second kind. By 30, I had stopped thinking about property as buildings and started thinking about it as systems. Cash flow, risk control, tenant retention, deferred maintenance, capital timing, human behavior disguised as paperwork. By 31, I had my CPA license and a private consulting practice on the side. By 32, I left salaried employment and took over operations for a small management portfolio. By 33, I owned minority stakes in 6 small multifamily properties and controlled one small management company outright. By 34, I bought out Joel's share in a mid-sized building in Cincinnati after he relocated to Texas. It was not a skyscraper, Not a trophy. Not the kind of thing Instagram people photograph with captions about legacy. It was a well-located older building with solid bones, decent occupancy, and enough deferred maintenance to scare off people who liked quick wins. I loved it immediately. 42 units. Brick exterior. A lobby that needed better lighting. A leasing office with frosted glass. A boiler that made me nervous until the second inspection came back clean. One roof section I replaced faster than the pro forma wanted, because I hate pretending a future leak is an acceptable strategy. I renamed nothing. Changed only what mattered. Paint. Fixtures. Systems. Vendor discipline. Tenant communication. Reserve planning. Exterior lighting. Laundry room contract. Parking. Resurfacing. Lease clarity. The name on the ownership paperwork read Naomi Vale Properties. LLC. My name. Mine. The first time I saw it on the insurance declaration page, I sat in my car and stared at it for a full minute. Not because it meant I had become rich, because it meant I had become real in a way no one could take back. Before I tell you how my father ended up in that building, take a second to subscribe if stories like this resonate with you. Not because drama is entertaining, because some of us had to build our self-respect in places no one thought to look. I did not keep tabs on my family, not actively, but information leaks through old networks, whether you ask for it or not. My mother had stayed. Of course she had. Evan drifted from job to job, each one apparently too rigid for his potential. My father got older in the way men do when pride starts costing more than it pays. He changed companies twice, took a buyout once, lost money on something involving a friend and a warehouse. There were whispers of debt, then more whispers, then the kind of silence that usually means the whispers were true. I heard most of it from Mrs. Jebu Weaver, who still lived in Dayton and had the social ecosystem of a county clerk crossed with a weather satellite. One evening she called and said, "You still don't talk to your people, right?" I said. "That phrasing tells me I shouldn't," she said. "Your father's house is in pre-foreclosure." I said nothing. She let that sit. Then she added, "And your brother is apparently living in his basement with a girlfriend who sells collagen drinks online." I laughed once. Not because it was kind. Because life has a way of humiliating people in genres they would never choose for themselves. I said, "That sounds unstable, Mrs." Weaver made a sound that might have been a snort. I expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt something more complicated. Not pity. Not love. Not even vindication. Recognition. Because houses, like families, can look stable long after the structure has already shifted underneath them. 2 months later, one of my leasing staff flagged an applicant file for manual review because the employment history was uneven and the credit score had cratered after a series of delinquent payments tied to a house they were surrendering. I was in the office late, working through renewals. When the file hit my inbox, Daniel Mercer, Karen Mercer, I stared at the screen long enough for the cursor to start blinking like an accusation. The listed current address was the house I had grown up in. The listed explanation for housing change read, "Seeking smaller rental after unexpected financial restructuring." Financial restructuring. There is something grotesque about the language people use when they are trying to make collapse sound managerial. I opened the full file. Income was lower than expected. Savings thin. Debt ugly. Their chosen unit was one of the better renovated 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor. Not luxury, just dignified. The kind of place someone rents when they are trying to preserve self-respect on a budget. My leasing agent, Marissa, knocked on the doorframe and said, "You okay?" I turned the monitor slightly away on instinct, then realized how absurd that was. The whole point of being safe is no longer having to hide. I said, "That applicant. I know them." She leaned one shoulder against the door. "Bad know them?" I looked back at the screen. "Yes." I said, "Very." Marissa. to her credit, did not pry. She only asked, "Do you want me to handle it?" And for a second, I considered saying yes. Let someone else rent them the unit. Let someone else take the paperwork. Let someone else answer questions. Let the whole thing happen without my face attached to it until the last possible second. That would have been easier, but not truer. So I said, "No, keep processing it normally. If they qualify under policy, we rent to them." Marissa nodded once. That was one thing I liked about her. She understood that boundaries are often built from tone, not explanation. My parents came to tour the unit 3 days later. I watched them first on the hallway camera. Not because I wanted drama, because I needed time for my nervous system to remember the difference between then and now. My father looked smaller, not in height, in certainty. His shoulders rounded inward more than I remembered. His hair had gone mostly white at the temples. My mother moved like someone trying not to take up too much space inside her own life. She was the first one who looked toward the office glass. Not because she saw me, because old instincts die hard. She had always been alert to where the mood of a room might be stored. Marissa gave the tour. I stayed back. Afterward, she said they wanted the unit. I told her to proceed. Their application met policy with a larger deposit and proof of retirement distribution covering risk. Everything clean. Everything legal. Everything boring. That mattered to me. I did not want poetic revenge. I wanted accuracy. They signed electronically first, then came in for final originals. And that was where the story returned to the beginning. The first time my father signed his name on a lease in my building, he did it with the same irritated confidence he used whenever he assumed the world was slightly beneath him. He didn't look up when he signed. He didn't ask who owned the place. He didn't notice the name printed at the top of the management packet. He only looked up when Marissa said, "Miss Vale will go over the final terms with you." Val, my name, the one he had not heard spoken aloud in 15 years, unless it was followed by disappointment. He turned, saw me, and for 1 second, all the practiced adult language fell out of his face. "Naomi?" he said. "Yes." I said, "It's my building." My mother made a sound so small it was almost private. His hand stayed on the pen. His eyes moved to the lease header. Then to me. Then back again. "You own this place?" He said, "Yes." He said my name again. Different now. Not affectionate. Not angry. Just disoriented by the failure of his own prediction. "What exactly do you do?" he asked. I could have said the whole thing then. The years, the books, the jobs, the nights, the duplexes, the reserves, the meetings, the ledgers, the refinances, the inspections, the contracts, the endless disciplined boredom that had become freedom. Instead, I said, "Enough." That answer landed harder than a resume ever could have. My father recovered first. He always did, even in disaster. His mind moved toward control faster than emotion. "So what now?" he asked. "You going to deny us the apartment?" There it was, the old script, as if he were still the one assigning moral tests, as if I needed to prove goodness to the man who had once thrown my clothes into a trash bag. I said, "If you meet policy, you get the apartment. If you violate the lease, you deal with management like anyone else." He stared at me. My mother whispered, "Naomi." I did not answer her, not out of cruelty, because my name in her mouth no longer had automatic permission to reach me. For a second I thought he might leave. That pride would override practicality, that he would choose homelessness over dependence if dependence had my face attached to it. But debt is stronger than ego when the options get narrow enough. He signed. That mattered more than any speech. Not because I wanted him under my roof. Because he was forced to participate in a reality he had once declared impossible. My parents moved in 2 weeks later. Not because I forced it, because they had nowhere better to go. That sentence would have sounded like fantasy to 19-year-old me. She would have tasted victory in it. 34-year-old me tasted something else. Proof. They lived quietly at first. That is common when proud people are newly dependent. You can almost hear the performance adjusting. No complaints. Rent paid on time. No nouvelles violations. No parking drama. No scenes in the hallway. My mother avoided the office. My father did not. He came in twice the first month with questions that did not need to be asked in person. Mailbox issue. Thermostat confusion. Clarification about trash pickup. Things any tenant could have emailed. It took me 2 visits to understand what he was doing. He wasn't asking about the property. He was trying to figure out the size of the life he had missed. Where I stood. How I spoke to staff. Whether people deferred to me. Whether this success was isolated or structural. He used to do that when I was a child too. Measure the room before deciding how much respect to give. Once. He stood in the office lobby while Marissa was discussing contractor bids with me. When she left, he said, "You seem comfortable giving orders." I said, "I'm comfortable being responsible." He didn't like that answer. I could tell, because he nodded, as if I had said something adolescent. Another time, he said, "Real estate is risky." I said, "So is underestimating people." He stopped coming in for a while after that. My mother was harder, not because she was crueler, because she was more human. Cruelty is clean. Cowardice is layered. One Tuesday, I found her sitting alone in the courtyard outside the building with a grocery bag on the bench beside her. It was early evening. The lights in the parking lot had not come on yet. The air smelled like wet concrete and cut grass. She looked up when I stepped outside and said, "I didn't know if you'd sit." I stood there for a second, then sat on the opposite end of the bench. She twisted the grocery receipt between her fingers. "I didn't know where you were for a long time," she said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because even now she was telling the story from the safest possible angle, as if not knowing were the tragedy, and not what she had permitted. I said, "You knew where I worked at the grocery store. You knew where I went to school. You knew Mrs. Weaver's address. Dayton isn't an ocean." She closed her eyes. "I know," she said. That may have been the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I asked her, "Why didn't you stop him?" She answered too fast at first. Fear. Stress. How bad things were at home. How impossible he became when challenged. How Evan was already falling apart. How she kept telling herself it would settle, then she stopped, shook her head, and tried again. "Because I was weak," she said, "and because I kept telling myself I could fix it later." That answer hurt more than excuses, because it was close enough to truth to matter. I said, "Later lasted 15 years. She started crying then. Quietly. The kind of crying older women do when they were raised to keep grief indoors and it leaks out anyway. I did not comfort her. That was new too. You can feel the shape of old conditioning when you refuse it. My body still wanted to hand tissues to the adults who failed me. But I sat still. Sometimes growth is nothing more glamorous than not abandoning yourself to make someone else's guilt easier. By the 3rd month, the building had settled into its normal rhythms. Grand cycle. Repairs. A leaking faucet on 2. An HVAC complaint on 4. A dog issue on 1. Ordinary life. Then came the annual rent adjustment notices. Nothing predatory. Just math. Insurance had gone up. Utilities had gone up. Taxes had shifted. I raised selectively, and within policy. Still fair. Still justified. Still enough to become a problem for people whose margins were gone. My parents' unit went up by $140. Not catastrophic, but enough. My father requested a meeting. Of course he did. He arrived in the office in the same navy quarter zip he wore when he wanted to look respectable without appearing as though he had tried. He closed the door behind him and sat without being invited. "This increase is excessive," he said. I slid the comparables across the desk. "It's below current market." He looked at the sheet and did not touch it. You know our situation. I did. That was not the point. I know the lease terms. I said. He leaned back, crossed his arms. And there, for the first time since moving in, I saw the old version of him clearly, not diminished, not embarrassed, offended that reality was not making exceptions for his relationship to power. This is personal, he said. I said. No. Personal was the night you threw me out with a trash bag full of clothes. This is business. He flinched, tiny, but real. Then he said the sentence that told me he had learned almost nothing. You're enjoying this. That is always how people like him interpret boundaries. Not as structure, as cruelty, if they are denied access. They imagine you must be feeding on the denial. I said. No, I'm protecting what I built. He laughed once. All this because of one bad night? There are sentences so revealing they do your work for you. One bad night. As if the problem had been the volume of the blow and not the architecture beneath it. As if the trash bag of clothes had not been the visible tip of years. As if the silence afterward were not a choice repeated daily for over a decade. I said. You still think it was one night? He looked away then. Toward the frosted glass. Toward the hallway. Toward anywhere the truth might become less precise if he didn't meet my eyes. The real confrontation happened a month later at the lease renewal review. My building holds a resident advisory meeting twice a year. Not glamorous. Just a practical gathering for long-term tenants about maintenance planning. Policy updates. Capital improvements. And optional renewals. Usually boring, which is exactly why what happened there hit so hard. My father came because he thought he could lobby. My mother came because she had learned not to let him go alone into rooms where reality might not obey him. Several long-term tenants were there. Marisa, our maintenance lead. Victor, 2 newer residents. And me. At the front of the room with the renewal packets. I had not planned drama. That's important. But truth has a way of revealing itself when people insist on arguing in public. I walked through the agenda. Roof work in spring. Laundry room vendor change. Parking repaint. Renewal terms. Then my father raised his hand like we were in a classroom and said, I'd like to ask why some of us are being pushed out by pricing decisions that feel less like management and more like punishment. You could feel the room adjust. Most people do not know what to do with that kind of line in a place designed for ordinary logistics. I said, no one is being singled out. Renewals are based on cost structure and market review. He smiled. That old smile. The one that tried to make contempt look reasonable. Easy to say. He said, when you own the place. There was a murmur then. Not because tenants hadn't known. Most had. Because they finally understood there was something more underneath the tone. He kept going. Some of us don't get family advantages. Some of us don't get handed opportunities. And there it was. The part of him that could never stop rewriting. Even now. Even here. He was trying to turn himself into the overlooked one. I said, very calmly, I was not handed this. He shrugged. One shoulder. Dismissive. You know what I mean. I did. And suddenly, I was 19 again. Except I wasn't. That's the strange thing about healing. The old room can return in your body. But now you have furniture in it. Language. Structure. A self that does not collapse just because memory appears. So I put the renewal packet down, looked directly at him, and said, no, I think everyone here deserves to know exactly what you mean. The room went quiet. My mother whispered, Daniel. He ignored her. I said, you mean that 15 years ago you told me I'd never amount to anything? You mean you threw me out with a duffel bag and a trash bag full of clothes? You mean you didn't speak to me again until you signed a lease in my building and didn't recognize my company name? Is that what you mean? No one in the room moved. Victor actually took one step backward. Marissa froze with her pen over the notepad. One of the older tenants covered her mouth. My father went red first. Then gray. "This is not appropriate," he said. I almost smiled. Because that is exactly what people say when the private version of themselves gets dragged into fluorescent light. "You made it appropriate when you accused me of punishment in front of my tenants," I said. "You don't get to turn your behavior into context and mine into spectacle." He stood up. My mother grabbed his wrist. Not hard, but enough. He looked at her in shock, as if she had broken some private marital law by touching his momentum. I kept going. Not because I wanted to perform. Because for the first time in my life, there were witnesses. And some truths deserve witnesses. "You told me I'd never amount to anything because I was working, studying, and trying to build a life you didn't find impressive enough. You threw me out because I answered one honest question with another. And then you spent 15 years not asking whether I survived. If this rent feels unfair to you, what exactly would you call the terms you offered me?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. That was the moment. Not the line. Not the reveal. The silence. The first honest thing he had offered me in years. My mother was crying by then. Quietly. Marissa still hadn't moved. One of the tenants stared at me with that look people get when they realize they have accidentally walked into the center of a story they will never forget. I said, "I'm not raising your rent because I'm your daughter. I'm not lowering it because I'm your daughter either. The lease is the lease. And boundaries are not cruelty just because you don't like them." That line stayed in the room. My father sat back down. Not because he agreed. Because the room had turned, and men like him understand social gravity better than they understand guilt. The meeting ended awkwardly. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. People avoided eye contact in that respectful way strangers do when they know they have just seen something too intimate to touch. Victor quietly told everyone he would email the roof schedule. Marissa collected packets with hands that had not quite stopped shaking. My parents were the last to leave. At the door, my mother turned back and said, "Naomi, I am sorry." Not Mom. "I'm sorry." Not baby. "I'm sorry." Not anything soft enough to reach back in time. Just the truth. Small, late, naked. I believed her. That is not the same as saying it changed what she was allowed to have from me. My father said nothing. That may have been the most accurate thing he had ever given me. The aftermath was slower than the reveal. That's how it usually goes. My mother began leaving small things outside the office once in a while. A loaf of banana bread. A scarf she said she had knitted years ago and never mailed. A birthday card that actually arrived on time. I did not invite intimacy. But I stopped returning everything. That distinction matters. Partial reconciliation is not softness. It is measured access. My father stopped coming to the office. Paid rent on time. Avoided the courtyard when he thought I might be there. Once, I saw him through the lobby glass carrying 2 grocery bags in from the car. Moving slower than I remembered. Shoulders bent under a weight that had nothing to do with food. I felt no triumph then. Only accuracy. That is the thing no one tells you about delayed justice. When it finally arrives, it often feels less like fireworks and more like correct accounting. A debt named, a story adjusted, a ledger balanced enough that you can sleep. Before I tell you how it finally settled between us, type boundaries in the comments. If you agree that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Winter passed. Then early spring, one Saturday morning, I found my father standing alone in the lobby, looking at the renovation photos we had framed near the mailboxes. Before pictures, after pictures, the old brick, the stripped floors, the new lighting, the courtyard cleanup. He didn't hear me approach at first. Then he said, still facing the wall, "You did all this." Not accusatory, not admiring, just stunned by evidence. "Yes," I said. He nodded once, still looking at the photos. After a long silence, he said, "I was wrong. I have replayed that moment in my mind more than once since. Not because it was beautiful, because it was so plain. No speech, no collapse, no dramatic father-daughter healing in soft light. Just 4 words from a man who had spent most of his life treating certainty like masculinity. I said nothing. He turned then, looked at me directly, and for the first time since I had been a child, he looked like someone without a strategy. I was wrong about you," he said. That mattered, but not in the way he probably hoped, because by then, I no longer needed his revised opinion to build a self. His apology could not become foundation. At best, it could become weather. Something real. Something noticed. Something that might pass through without rearranging the house. So I said, "Yes." That answer hurt him. I could see it. But sometimes truth arrives too late to be entitled to comfort. He asked, "Do you think there's any way to make this less broken?" I looked at him for a long time. Then I said the truest thing I had. "I think broken things can become honest. I don't think they become unbroken." He nodded. Slowly, like each word had to move through years to get to him. "We still speak. Carefully. Sparingly. He never became easy. I never became careless. My mother and I do better than I expected, and worse than sentimental people might want." Evan texted me once after the meeting and said, "You were right about him years ago." That was his whole message. I replied, "I know. We have not become close. Sometimes truth is enough without intimacy following behind it." My parents moved out at the end of their second lease term and into a smaller condo in a neighboring suburb after my father's retirement distribution finally came through. The move-out inspection was clean. No damage. Keys returned on time. Forwarding address submitted correctly. Again, I noticed the ordinary details, because that is what my life was built from. Not speeches. Not revenge fantasies. Ordinary details handled properly over years. A while after they left, I stood in the empty unit by the front window just before sunset. The walls were clean, the carpet lines still visible from the vacuum. Outside, the parking lot lights came on one by one, and I thought about the girl walking out of her father's house with a duffel bag and a trash bag full of clothes. What would I say to her now? Not that it all worked out. That's too neat. And it isn't true anyway. I would tell her this: you are not losing your future. You are losing access to people who confused control with love. That will hurt longer than anyone admits. But it is not the same thing as becoming nothing. I would tell her that usefulness is not the same as worth. That competence can become a kind of shelter. That being underestimated has a hidden advantage if you survive it long enough. I would tell her that one day the same man who measured her as small will stand in a building she owns and realize he was never the authority on what her life could become. And I would tell her one more thing. Success does not erase humiliation. It recontextualizes it. The wound stays in the story. It just stops being the ending. So yes, my dad told me I'd never amount to anything. 15 years later, he signed a lease in my building and didn't even know it. Not because life is a fairy tale, because discipline compounds, because contempt is often lazy, because people who dismiss you usually stop paying attention long before you stop building. And maybe that is the quietest kind of justice there is, not making them suffer, making their certainty irrelevant. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And tell me where you're watching from and whether you think some apologies arrived too late to open the same door they closed.